How's everybody doing today? You're watching Slot Car Mayhem. I'm John, and this will be episode 19 of the Glendale 65. And today we're going to climb down a rabbit hole, so to speak. The reason why I'm doing this video is I was putting one together showing a graphic overview of the track and how the wiring is run and how the circuits will be implemented and all that, just so you can get a better overview of what I'm doing with the track from an electrical standpoint. And I ended up taking a hard left turn in the middle of that and started climbing down this rabbit hole that involves the street lighting, or the lighting that'll be used on the track directly over the roadway for night running, street lights if you want to call them. And I decided that that probably needed to be a video on its own, and so here we are, and we'll go through the process of why I'm doing what I'm doing, and more importantly, how easy it is to take something that's prototypical and bring it into our model and have it fail miserably, even though it's dimensionally accurate. So we'll go through that process and you'll see what I'm talking about. I'll provide a couple of examples of how that actually works, and we'll go on from there. We'll apply it, we'll get something reasonable that we need into place, and we'll show you that step and how that's done. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot to cover, so we'll go ahead and we'll go on from there. First things first, and I will provide a link to it in the description, and that has to do with Colorado's Department of Transportation for the state of Colorado, version 2019, and it's their road and highway lighting standard. And I chose that particular one generally because the layout is very user-friendly. It's very easy to find what you're looking for. It covers so many different scenarios that if you want an example of how to model a particular scene, just about everything you can imagine is covered in there, from roadway lighting for overpasses, interchanges, any type of interchange you can think of, including roundabouts. They even have sections on pedestrian walkway lighting. So it's got everything you need to get a reference to bring a prototypical element into your layout. That being said, some of the key takeaways out of there are two particular things. In fact, number one is for an average main type road like we would use for a racetrack, the lighting, according to the standards, is between 30 and 70 feet high. That's a huge range, and so of course we'll stay on the short side of that spectrum. And to make the math easy, we'll say our lighting is 32 feet high. That way, when it translates down into 1/32 scale, that makes the math easy. It's just 1 foot high. So we have street lights that are going to be 1 foot high, and according to the standards also, it says that you should start your spacing at a ratio of 6:1, meaning you have your spacing to height ratio is 6:1. So our spacing should be about 6 feet. So let's take a look, and I got some props here that hopefully will kind of explain what we're doing. So this piece here, I'm sure everybody's seen it. This is actually 1 foot in length, so this is a good example of what we'll be doing. And if we stick that over here, and if we compare that to the car, you can see that it looks reasonable. It's proportional to the car. Everything seems to work. We got a street light over here. Everything seems to look proper. Everything's fine and good and well. The problem starts to come in when we start looking at our spacing. And if we apply our spacing criteria, see, we got a street light over here. Our next one will be about 6 feet away, which would be right here. So now all of a sudden we've got lights that are spaced so far apart that it's not going to look correct, obviously, on this particular layout. And right here in this area, I'm going to be having buildings and everything, so I'm not concerned with the street lighting because there'll be floodlights on the buildings. But on that back diagonal curve I have over here, that's going to allow me to have 2 lights on that long straight, that diagonal straight, and I'll have 2 overhead lights, and that's really not the look we're going for. So what's going on? It's hard to say. Well, let's take another look at an example here, and we'll see if we can kind of clarify exactly what's going on. So I'm going to grab the camera and I'm going to move the camera to another location, and we'll show you what we're talking about. Okay, we're going to use a little prop or two, and we're going to further explain our problem. We've already determined that we're kind of looking at 1 foot height for our street lighting, but it may not be what we want because the spacing is so far and long that it's not doing what we want to do. So let's take another real world example. In this case, we would be a tree. And here I've got a piece of aluminum angle, and this is exactly 18 inches in length, which is why I'm using it. Well, 18 inches translates into real world scale from 1/32 to 48 feet. And honestly, 48 feet is not tall, very tall at all for a tree actually. Almost every tree I have in my backyard is much taller than that, but we use 48 foot for a good example. Now if you can imagine this tree. We've got our leaves and the tree itself formed right here, and this little part here would be the trunk side of it, if you can imagine that. If we lay that down like the tree fell, again, you compare that with the car, it looks perfectly reasonable. It does not look big at all, right? It looks perfectly fine. If you can just imagine the bushes and everything and the trunk, it's, you know, it looks exactly the way it should because we're comparing it to the car itself. Well, let's take that tree and let's plant that on this hill over here. All of a sudden now you can see that this tree looks completely ridiculous in scale. It looks way out of proportion. So what's going on? What's happening here? Well, if we start talking scale, we're basing our scale off the size of the car itself. In this case, it's 1/32. Generally, when you're doing any sort of layout, be it a model railroad or a slot car or anything of that nature, you've got 3 specific scales that you're actually working with. We're not working with 1/32 scale itself. We're working with, let's talk about the track itself and what it is. If we look at the track as a whole, and if I just close my eyes, and if I use my mind's eye to determine, all right, how long do I want it to look visually? By the time I change different scenic elements all the way around the track, I'm looking at maybe mile and a quarter in length. It's what it feels like when you're running it because of the different changes in scenery. If I look at it like it is right now, bare bones, because of all the back and forth the track presents, I'm looking at maybe 3/4 of a mile, somewhere around there, because there's nothing to break it up, so it looks one continuous length, and it looks to be about maybe 3/4 of a mile because we're going back and forth a lot. If I do the math, what we find out is a real world mile scaled down to 1/32 is actually 165 feet in length. This track is called the Glendale 65 because it's 65 feet in running length. 65 feet versus 165 feet, that's only 4/10 of a mile. Okay, so we've got 3 scenarios going on here. We got what it feels like, what it looks like, and what it actually is. So what we need to do is we need to accommodate for this. And this is often referred to in terms of model railroading as selective compression. What is it? How does it end up here? How did this happen? How this happens is very simple. The number one cause for compression on a layout is the radius of your curves. That's the number one cause. If we actually take a look at the radii that we have on our curve sections and we apply them into real world, we might be surprised at what we actually find. If we look at, let's say, an example would be the inside radius of an R1 would probably be in real world pretty close. If you can imagine making a left-hand turn from one side street to another, that's probably pretty close to an R1 radius that we have here on our track. Likewise, the biggest radius, the R4s, that's probably translatable pretty much comparative to let's say, a clover leaf that you would find on an interstate exchange. So the radiuses are much, much smaller than you would find in the real world. That allows you to get a reasonable running length in a reasonable space. If we look at a track, let's say, let's pick Elkhart Lake, for example. That track is just a little over 4 feet in length in the real world. If that translates down in the 1/32nd scale, you're looking at 660 feet of running length, which could be quite significant. That's a big layout, 660 feet. And if you imagine trying to build it, instead of doing all these switchbacks, and build it as one continuous track like Elkhart Lake is, you're going to find that you're going to pretty much need a warehouse if you want to build a scaled replica of that track down in 1/32nd scale. So compression is something we have to deal with. It's very common in model railroading, very common in this here too, and we have to be aware of it. And we have to bring our elements into play to accommodate for it. So, and this here shows how a prototypical, relatively small tree can look completely out of place on a layout where this world that we're building is much smaller than we're trying to make it look. Elements have to be brought down in size too to accommodate. Okay, like I said earlier, there's 3 general scales we're actually going to be working with. And I like to put them into 3 classes. I have a fixed scale on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, I have our world scale. And where we're going to be working at is the middle scale. And the middle scale is an arbitrary value, and it's based solely on proportion. It has very little place using real data or real numbers scaled down. It's a matter of proportion and what we want to achieve. And those type of elements are designed to tie the two together. The real world hard scale, like for the cars that we're working in, and the other scale of the world we're modeling. And a good example of hard scale in this case would be exactly one of the cars we're working with, but the things and the items that are directly related to this particular scale. So an example of that would be, we got our cars, also our figures that we're going to use. They should be the same scale as the car itself. And if we look at things like structures, the doorways and the windows and ceiling heights need to accommodate both the cars and the figures that you're going to use. You don't want to have a doorway where somebody has to walk up and reach up to open the door, or you don't want to have it to where it looks like everybody has to duck to walk into a door. They've got to be in proportion. And that's generally, when we say we're going to be working in 1/32nd scale, that's what we're going to be working with. The far side of the spectrum, of course, is the world that we're working in, which is actually very compressed. So this middle ground that we're talking about can be, it's very important, and it can be very arbitrary. Fortunately, there's a lot of items out there that fall into this category, and if we stop and analyze them and think about them, they have quite a few attributes in common, and that makes it very easy to make these transitions and to keep everything in proportion. Let's talk about things that we're talking about right now. Your street lighting. Let's talk about trees. Let's talk about billboards. Let's even talk about a traffic light. These are things that are very common, and they all share these attributes. They're very common. Everybody knows what they are. They see them every day. You also don't know very much specifics about them. They're just taken for what they are, and other than that, they're disregarded. You hear the term all the time about, oh, an airplane flying at treetop level. What is treetop level? Can you give me a number that dictates treetop level? No, you can't. It just says you're flying just above the trees. How tall is that? I don't know. It depends on where you're at, what the trees are. It varies greatly. But treetop level itself is considered to be a value that has no real meaning when you get technical. Same thing with street lighting. You don't drive down the road and say, hey, that light is 4 feet taller than the light I passed a mile and a half ago. Nobody pays them any attention, and they don't regard that in size. However, everybody has a picture in their head about what it should be, how tall it should be. And another thing is they're usually viewed from a distance, a relative distance, and you really don't know the true scale of them based on that fact that you see them from a distance. And a great example of that is, have you ever had a traffic light that somebody has come over, dropped down, and set right there in front of you where you could just reach over and touch it? And when people experience that for the first time, their first reaction is almost always, well, that's a lot bigger than I thought they were. You lose that sense of size and proportion when it's brought into an element that you can't reach out and touch, and you have implied distance, and that's the way you generally view everything. So this can be really important and really vital to make these transitions from one scale to another that we have to deal with here, and the end results can be phenomenal. And the key is, you've got to go for the look you want to achieve. Going back to our tree example that we showed with the aluminum angle, it's pretty obvious that we got to shrink that tree down to get the look that we're after. In this case, we want a tree of about such and such height to where it balances out the scene and looks correct. And we run into that everywhere, and that's how we have to work through things. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply that same logic to our street lighting. And the reason why is, once I finally figure out what I want to do, then I'll know about how many lights I'm going to have, so I know how I need to design the circuits to drive those lights. Currently, if I go by the standards and use straight prototypical dimensions, I'll have about 8 lights on this whole layout, and that's not nearly what I want. I want to use a lot more street lighting to imply that level of distance. And if we just go ahead and we shorten up our spacing as we go, it's going to look completely out of place, because it looks like you're just going to have a forest of lights all spaced close together. So the first thing we need to do is we need to shrink down our height. So we need to find a reasonable height. And I've made some wooden blocks here with a hole drilled in it, and I just have a piece of balsa wood strip, and these are about 7 inches in height. So if I do that, we go from 12 to 7, I can see that by looking at this, okay, we've got the indicated look we want. We want a street light that's considerably taller than the cars. Okay, so we can shorten down our height a little bit versus the 12 inches. So we've gone quite a bit. We've gone from 12 inches to 7, and we still have a decent look as far as height is concerned. All right, this pile of mess we have over here, this is actually representative of pretty much what I'm going to be doing for the pit buildings. They're going to be about the same footprint as a whole straight section of track. It's going to be about 9 inches high, so we're about here in height and pretty close. And if we bring our street lighting here and put it in the same view as the building, what's going on and what are we seeing? Once again, keep in mind that this height of the street lighting, nobody really knows what they are, and they can vary greatly, but everybody takes them as a reference point. And if we compare that, which is just a little bit shorter than the height of the building, now this building itself looks much bigger, because we have what we think is a fixed reference right here, and bringing our buildings into perspective with this item that appears to be a fixed height. And so we've made our buildings look bigger, but at the same time, now that we have this building that we think is bigger than it actually is, the street light, which is just below the height of the building, now also looks taller by comparison. So by applying a correct value of selective compression and applying it to other elements of your layout, you're able to tie these things together and get a general look that we're after. So what do we do about spacing? Well, again, since I've shortened my height, I can shorten my spacing in comparison. And the ratio is 6 to 1, and so that would be, instead of a 6-foot spacing, we would be looking at 42 inches spacing, which we're getting there. And but since we're compressing the height and we're compressing our spacing at the same value. And the specifications also indicate that you should start at a ratio of 6:1 and then you can adjust accordingly. We can shorten up our spacing even further. So what I have here is I have a piece that's 28 inches in length. So if I go with a spacing ratio of 4:1 versus 6:1, we can see that I'm starting to get a much more reasonable look on our spacing. And we could go ahead and do this, and we can check our spacings accordingly. And we're going to have a much more reasonable look. And the reason why this is important is the spacing of your roadway lights are going to imply length. And that can be very important, especially on a layout like this. If we went with prototypical, dimensionally accurate lighting and spacing, it would be too tall and the spacing would be too far apart, and it would just make the whole track look very short. And that's what we don't want. So we're going to fudge the numbers of our prototypical lights to get the look that we're after, and we're still going to end up with a very reasonable look, and it's going to just help the overall length and make the whole track itself look longer. Because again, people don't realize how tall these things are in real life. All they know is they are at a height, and other items in the layout are going to be compared to that height. So you got to be careful about how you're going to apply these sizes. And the reason why I've done this exercise is that's exactly what I intend to use to calculate about how many lights I'm going to need. If we go back to our previous design of 1 foot high, spacing of 6:1, I would have had 2 lights on that back diagonal, which is my focus point for how I want to do the design. Now that we've altered things and brought them down into a proportion that's acceptable, now I'll find out I'll have 5 to 6 lights on that same section. And that's going to help me greatly achieve the look I want and implied distance. Everybody knows about how far these things are apart when they drive down the highway. That's what helps that illusion of creating length. So that's how that kind of works. And I hate to keep using model railroad examples, but that can be very important because a lot of times we find our buildings are selectively compressed as well. And actually a wonderful friend of mine who's passed a few years ago, he was a elderly gentleman and a very old school model railroader. And he loved doing all aspects of it, but he really hated doing structures, building his kits. Hated it, just wasn't what he wanted to do. And so I told him so for years. I used to build kits for him all the time. I said, well, I'll do it, I'll knock them out for you, it's not a big deal. And weather them up real nice, make them pretty, do little things to them, and there you go. He was happy, I was happy. And we got into that subject of selective compression one day. And he never really could get his head wrapped around it. He understood it because he was able to apply it, but he didn't know he knew it, if that makes any sense. So, we're talking back and forth, and I'm trying to explain to him what's going on. He said, I just do what looks right, it doesn't matter. And that really is all the takeaway. If you make it to where it looks the way you want, you're good to go. And I said, sometimes you gotta alter a few things to make them look the way you want. You just don't know why you need to do it or how that needs to happen. So we got in this discussion, and he just kind of couldn't get it. And, which is all fine and well. So I said, okay, I'm gonna do a real world example. So he gives me a few kits to build, 3 of them. So I build those for him. Okay, here you go. But I also made 2 more, and both of them were the same structure. They were the house I was currently living in at the time, actually. And I drew the blueprints for it and everything, therefore I had all the information I needed, so I just went ahead and knocked that out, and it didn't take hardly any time at all. But both of those houses had a distinct difference. One was completely scaled down, dimensionally accurate version, and one was a selectively compressed version. And so when I brought those over, I kept the compressed version off to the side, but I said, here's another one I built for you. And he's like, oh, that's your house. I said, yeah. He said, oh, that's gorgeous. Thank you. And he tried to put it on his light. He said, I can't use it. It's the wrong scale. I said, no, it's not. He said, yeah, it's complete. Look how big it is. Okay. Well, how about this one? Same building, things are shrunk down, moved around a little bit, the doors, windows, things like that, ceiling heights, okay. It didn't look the same, but it looked like it was supposed to. And he was able to use that one on his layout, but the dimensionally accurate one, he couldn't do it. And so I said, this is the reason why. And your buildings are all selectively compressed. They don't reflect real world dimensions at all. It's a transitional piece from one scale to another. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And that's why you can't, I've heard questions about why can't it, how big is a 1/32nd scale tree? I don't know how big is a real tree. Doesn't matter. It's an arbitrary height. They vary tremendously and they have no real application to what we're doing. I find it comical sometimes how you could go buy a bag of N scale or HO scale trees because really they serve no value other than they might apply to a height somewhere that may be applicable. And the same thing goes through with so many elements on our layout. And so don't get hung up on the dimensionally accurate stuff. If you find something such as street lighting and you have a reference to go by to give you an idea of how you want to apply it, apply compression as you need to comparative to other elements of your layout, and you're going to find that your results are going to look better, they're going to look more realistic, and people will accept them as reality and precise scale without ever any considerations to the fact that the whole world is shrunk down quite a bit. And that can be very important. I just came across a post on Facebook where somebody mentioned this exact same thing about trees on a layout, using a 1/32nd scale tree as 1 foot for an example. And this should be at least a foot high. And as we can see, that's not going to work very well. Even a modest tree of 48 feet is not going to translate very well. So size your elements to fit the scene you're working with and to get the proportion that you want and the look that you want. And in so many cases you can completely just disregard any sort of real world scale. Very important to understand that, and that will help. I've seen so many layouts where they have these big tall lights, and if you're lighting a layout simply to light it and to make it easier to run, that's perfectly fine. And this is more of a discussion for somebody who's trying to do something a little bit more prototypical, generally a high scenic layout, and you want to bring an element of realism to it. That's where this comes into play. So we'll keep this episode relatively short, and we'll get ready to move on to the next one, which is kind of long. It's just one rabbit hole over this way, and that has to do with structure lighting. So that'll be our next video. And that also accommodates and allows for this wonderful little term of selective compression, and we'll get into that episode next. So that should be again, this was an exercise in how to implement selective compression and bring it into your layout and make things look correct, and that's what we're attempting to do here. So now I've got a basis for design, I can move forward and we'll see what we got. So that'll wrap this episode up, and if you guys have any questions or comments, please just hit me up. If you haven't hit that notification button, go ahead and slam that thing. I'm going to have some interesting content coming out here in the next week or so, and hopefully I can get back to construction on the track. I'm waiting for some router parts to come in so I can fix my router, and we'll move forward with that and we'll proceed. And the holidays are coming up too, so there's a lot of other content coming out. And just make sure everybody stays safe and take care of yourself and your families and do what you need to do for you. And as always, thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.